I heard my daughter-in-law on the phone, calmly explaining how she would push me out of my own home, room by room, until I left on my own. What hurt was not just the plan, but the certainty in her voice, as if I was already gone. And when I turned to my son for support, I realized something even worse. He was not confused. He was not conflicted. He was silent. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. That was the moment I stopped being a mother trying to keep peace and became a woman preparing to defend her life. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and I am 68 years old. I have lived in Charleston, South Carolina for most of my life, long enough to watch the tides shape the shoreline and the seasons soften into something predictable and familiar. After my husband passed away 12 years ago, the world became quieter, but not empty. I learned how to fill the silence with routines, with small rituals that gave shape to my days and reminded me that I was still living, not merely existing. The house I live in sits on a quiet street not far from the water. It is a 2-story wooden home with pale blue shutters and a wide front porch that catches the morning light. My husband and I built it together over 25 years, making decisions slowly, carefully, always thinking about what would last. Every corner of that house carries a memory. The worn armchair by the window still holds the shape of where he used to sit and read the newspaper every evening. The framed photograph of our wedding day rests on the mantel above the fireplace, slightly faded but still full of warmth. Out back, the garden we planted together continues to bloom each spring, as if it refuses to forget him. After he died, I did not change much. I kept the house the way it was, not because I was afraid of moving on, but because it felt like the one place where everything still made sense. I built a life that was simple but steady. I walked along the shoreline most mornings, letting the sound of the waves settle my thoughts. In the afternoons, I would make myself tea and sit by the window, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching the light shift across the room. On Saturdays, I met with a small group of friends for coffee, women who, like me, had learned how to carry both loss and independence at the same time. My son, Daniel, has always been at the center of everything I did. He is 40 now, a civil engineer with a practical mind and a quiet way of speaking. I raised him mostly on my own after his father passed, balancing long hours at work with the responsibility of being both parent and provider. It was not easy, but I never let him feel the weight of that struggle. I wanted him to grow up believing the world was stable, even when it was not. When Daniel told me he was getting married, I felt something I had not felt in years. It was not just happiness. It was relief. I thought he had finally found someone who would stand beside him, someone who would build a life with him the way I once had with his father. Her name was Vanessa Carter. She was younger, polished, confident, and she carried herself with a kind of certainty that made people pay attention. 2 months after the wedding, Daniel told me they were thinking about moving in with me for a while. He said it would only be temporary, just until they could save enough money to buy a place of their own. I did not hesitate. I told him the house was big enough, that there was plenty of room, that they were always welcome. What I did not tell them was that the house was still entirely mine. I had once considered transferring ownership to Daniel, but something inside me had made me pause. I could not explain it at the time. It was not distrust. It was something quieter, something closer to instinct. Looking back now, I understand that decision better than I did then. At the time, it felt small, almost insignificant, but it was not. It was the one thing that would later make all the difference. If you're still watching and already sensing something isn't quite right beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. When Daniel and Vanessa moved into the house, I told myself that change was natural. A home that had once been quiet was now filled with new energy, new rhythms, and new habits. At first, I welcomed it. Vanessa was polite, attentive in a way that felt almost rehearsed, but I chose to see it as kindness. She called me mom, offered to help in the kitchen, and complimented the house often enough that I believed she appreciated it. I made a conscious effort not to interfere. I stayed out of their way, adjusted my routines, and reminded myself that this was no longer just my space. I did not want to become the kind of mother-in-law people whispered about. I wanted to be easy to live with, easy to accept. The changes began subtly. One afternoon, I came home from my walk and found the living room arranged differently. The coffee table had been moved closer to the window, and one of the chairs had been replaced with something sleek and unfamiliar. Vanessa smiled and said she thought it opened up the space. I nodded, even though I had liked it the way it was. Over the next few days, more things shifted. Decorative pieces disappeared from shelves. New items appeared in their place, modern and impersonal. The house began to feel less like a reflection of a life lived and more like something staged. I told myself it was just a matter of taste. Then one morning, I noticed the portrait of my husband was gone from the entryway. In its place hung a large mirror with a gold frame. It reflected light beautifully, but it did not belong there. I found the portrait later, leaned carefully against the wall in my bedroom, as if it had been moved aside rather than removed. I stood there for a long time, looking at it, feeling something tighten in my chest that I could not quite name. Daniel did not say anything about any of it. Either he did not notice, or he chose not to. I did not ask. I had already begun to understand that asking questions might lead to answers I was not ready to hear. Each day, the house felt a little less familiar. Small adjustments accumulated until I could no longer ignore them. It was not just the physical space that was changing. It was the way I moved through it. I began to hesitate before entering rooms, to pause before touching things, as if I needed permission that no one had given. Vanessa's tone began to change as well. The warmth in her voice softened into something more distant. Sometimes she called me Margaret instead of Mom, and though it was a small difference, it carried a meaning I could not ignore. It felt like a quiet correction, a repositioning of roles. I continued to stay silent. I told myself that peace required patience, that adjustment took time, that families found their balance eventually. But beneath that reasoning, something else was growing. A quiet awareness that I was no longer being included in decisions about my own home. The moment everything became clear happened on an ordinary morning. I returned home earlier than usual, my walk cut short by a sudden change in the weather. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, but I could hear Vanessa's voice coming from the living room. I stopped before entering. I did not intend to listen, but her words held me in place. She was speaking on the phone, her tone calm, almost casual. She spoke about timing, about patience, about how things were already moving in the right direction. She said that with a little more pressure, I would eventually choose to leave on my own. She spoke as if the outcome was certain, as if my presence in that house was temporary and already fading. I stood there, completely still. I did not feel shock. I did not feel anger, at least not immediately. What I felt was clarity. Everything I had been noticing, every small change, every quiet shift, suddenly made sense. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been harmless. It had all been part of something deliberate. I stepped back quietly and left the house without making a sound. The air outside felt different, sharper somehow, as if the world had shifted in a way only I could see. As I walked down the street, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. I was not being welcomed into a shared life. I was being pushed out of my own. And for the first time since they moved in, I knew I could not afford to ignore it anymore. If that moment gave you a feeling something much bigger is coming, comment number 2 below, so I know you're paying attention. Now, let's continue to chapter 3. I returned home that morning with a different awareness, one that settled quietly but firmly into every thought I had. Nothing in the house had changed overnight, yet everything felt altered because I was no longer seeing it through the same lens. Before, I'd explained things away. Now, I was paying attention. Vanessa moved through the house with a kind of ease that I had once mistaken for comfort. Now, it looked more like ownership. She spoke with quiet authority, making decisions as if they required no discussion. The tone she used was not openly disrespectful, but it carried an assumption that unsettled me. It was the tone of someone who believed she belonged at the center of everything. I began to notice the details I had previously ignored. My belongings were no longer where I had left them. Drawers had been reorganized. Cabinets in the kitchen had been rearranged so that nothing felt familiar. The system I had used for years, the one that allowed me to move through the space without thinking, had been replaced by something that did not include me. One afternoon, I opened a cabinet and found my cookware stacked in a box on the floor. In their place were new pots and pans, polished and unused. There had been no conversation, no request, no acknowledgement that those items had once meant something to me. They had simply been replaced. Daniel was in the room when I noticed it. He leaned against the counter, watching me with a distant expression, as if he were waiting to see how I would respond. I asked him quietly if he knew about the changes. He shrugged and said they were just trying to improve things. His voice was calm, almost detached, as if the situation did not require any deeper thought. That was the moment I realized he was no longer standing beside me. He was standing somewhere in between, and that space did not include my perspective. The changes continued, each one small on its own, but overwhelming when taken together. The living room no longer felt like a place where I could sit comfortably. The kitchen no longer functioned the way I needed it to. Even the hallway seemed different, as if the walls themselves had shifted to accommodate a new presence. Then I found the documents. They were left on the kitchen counter, partially covered by a stack of mail. At first, I thought they were work papers, something Daniel had brought home. But when I looked closer, I saw diagrams of the house, measurements, and detailed notes about renovations. There were figures written in the margins, estimates that added up to nearly $40,000. I read through the pages slowly, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was not just a plan. It was a decision already in motion. There were references to contractors, timelines, and financing options. The address listed at the top of the page was my home. I stood there for a long time, holding the papers, feeling a strange stillness settle over me. It was not the amount of money that unsettled me. It was the realization that none of this had been discussed with me. No one had asked for my opinion. No one had even considered that I might have one. When Vanessa walked into the kitchen, she noticed the papers in my hands but did not seem surprised. Her expression remained composed, almost expectant. I asked her if these plans were final. She replied that they were moving forward with them soon, as if the decision had already been made. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sense that she was overstepping. She spoke as if she had every right to shape the future of the house. I placed the papers back on the counter and stepped away. There was nothing more to say in that moment. The conversation, or lack of one, had already told me everything I needed to know. I walked through the house slowly, looking at each room as if I were seeing it for the first time. The walls, the furniture, the small details that had once made it mine all felt distant, as if they belonged to a version of my life that was already gone. I understood then that I was still living in the house, but I was no longer living in my home. If you can feel how everything is starting to shift and nothing will ever be the same again, comment number 3 below. Now let's move into chapter 4. I did not confront them after that. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations. Instead, something inside me shifted into a different kind of awareness, one that was quieter but far more deliberate. I had spent weeks reacting, adjusting, trying to preserve peace. Now, I understood that peace had already been taken from me. What remained was the choice of how I would respond. From the outside, nothing about my routine changed. I still woke early and walked along the shoreline, letting the steady rhythm of the waves settle my thoughts. I still made tea in the afternoon and sat by the window, watching the light move across the floor. If anyone had been observing me, they might have believed that I had accepted the situation, that I had chosen to step back and allow things to unfold. But inside, I was no longer passive. I was paying attention in a way I never had before. I began to notice details with precision. Every object that was moved, every item that disappeared, every new addition that appeared in its place. I took photographs quietly, not out of sentiment but out of necessity. I documented the changes in a way that felt almost clinical, as if I were recording evidence rather than memories. I saved messages, even the ones that seemed insignificant, because I had learned that meaning often revealed itself over time. I kept track of conversations, noting what was said and when, not to replay them, but to understand the pattern forming beneath them. It was no longer about how I felt in the moment. It was about seeing the structure of what was happening. The decision to seek legal advice came slowly. It was not a reaction to a single event, but the result of everything accumulating into something undeniable. I sat at my desk one evening, looking at the documents I had gathered, and realized that I could not navigate this alone. The situation had moved beyond family tension into something more defined, something that required clarity. The next morning, I searched for a property lawyer in Charleston. The process felt strangely distant, as if I were helping someone else rather than myself. When I scheduled the appointment, I felt a brief hesitation, a quiet question about whether I was taking things too far. But that hesitation passed quickly. Doing nothing was no longer an option. The lawyer's office was calm, organized, and entirely removed from the tension I had been living in. When I explained my situation, he listened without interruption, his expression neutral but attentive. He reviewed the documents I brought, reading them carefully before looking up at me. He told me the house was entirely mine. There were no shared claims, no hidden agreements, no legal ambiguity. I had full authority over the property. No one could force me to leave. No one could make decisions about it without my consent. The words settled into me slowly. I had known this in a way, but hearing it spoken clearly changed something. It replaced uncertainty with structure. It gave form to what I had been feeling but could not fully articulate. He advised me to continue documenting everything, to remain calm and not to confront the situation prematurely. He explained that patience would give me the strongest position, that acting too quickly could complicate what was otherwise straightforward. When I left his office, I felt a mixture of relief and something heavier. Relief, because I was not powerless, and something heavier, because I understood that whatever came next would not be undone easily. Returning home, I saw everything differently again. Vanessa moved through the space with the same confidence, Daniel with the same distance. Nothing had changed for them, but for me, everything had shifted into focus. I spoke less. I observed more. I stopped trying to explain myself or justify my presence. There was no longer a need for that. I was no longer seeking understanding. I was preparing. That night, I sat in my room with the original deed to the house in my hands. I read it slowly, line by line, not because I doubted it, but because I needed to remind myself of something simple and undeniable. This house was mine. And whatever happened next, I would not allow that truth to be rewritten. If you realize she is no longer staying silent, but quietly preparing for something serious, comment number 4 below to stay with me. Now, let's go to chapter 5. The tension in the house had been building for weeks, but that evening it finally stepped out into the open, no longer disguised behind polite smiles or careful words. Vanessa called it a family dinner, but there was something about the way she prepared for it that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. She moved through the kitchen with quiet control, directing every detail without asking for help. Her mother, Linda, had arrived earlier that afternoon and settled in as if she belonged there. Daniel stayed mostly silent, moving between rooms with a distant expression, as though he already knew what was coming but did not want to face it. I took my seat at the table without asking any questions. By then, I had learned that the absence of information often spoke louder than any explanation. The table was set carefully, the plates aligned, the food arranged with precision. It looked like a normal evening, but the air carried something heavier beneath the surface. Vanessa began the conversation slowly, speaking about the future in a way that felt both hopeful and calculated. She talked about stability, about building something lasting, about what it meant to create a proper home. Her words were chosen carefully, each one placed where it would have the most effect. She spoke about children next, about the kind of environment they would need, about space and comfort. It was all framed as a shared vision, something we were meant to consider together. But as she continued, the direction of her words became clear. She introduced the idea gently, as if it had only just occurred to her. She said that perhaps it would be better for me to move somewhere more suitable, somewhere designed for someone at my stage in life. She described retirement communities in detail, emphasizing comfort, safety, and convenience. I listened without interrupting. I did not react, not because I agreed, but because I needed to understand how far they were willing to go. When she finished, I turned to Daniel. I asked him what he thought. It was a simple question, but it carried more weight than anything else said that evening. He did not look at me at first. His eyes remained fixed on his plate, his hands still. For a moment, I thought he might say something different, something that would shift the direction of the conversation. But he did not. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost careful, as if he were trying to soften the impact of his words. He said it might be a good idea. The room did not change, but something inside me did. It was not a sudden collapse or an overwhelming wave of emotion. It was quieter than that. It was the recognition that the last piece had fallen into place. Linda leaned forward slightly, adding her own perspective with a tone that suggested concern, but carried something sharper beneath it. She spoke about safety, about responsibility, about how difficult it could be to maintain a house at my age. Her words were structured to sound reasonable, but the meaning behind them was clear. I sat there, absorbing everything, allowing the moment to settle without resisting it. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty to hold on to. What they were asking was not a suggestion. It was a decision they had already made, one they expected me to accept. I placed my napkin on the table and stood up slowly. There was no urgency in my movement, no visible reaction that might give them something to respond to. I simply stepped away from the table, aware of their eyes following me. As I walked toward the front of the house, I felt something settle into place within me. It was not anger, not fear, not even sadness. It was clarity. For weeks, I had been watching, waiting, trying to understand what was happening around me. Now I understood completely, and for the first time, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I walked toward the front door with a steadiness I had not felt in weeks. Behind me, I could sense their attention shifting, waiting for a reaction that never came. The air in the house had changed, thick with expectation, but I no longer felt part of it. I had already stepped beyond that moment. When I reached the door, the bell rang. The timing was exact, almost unreal, but it grounded me. I opened it without hesitation. My lawyer stood on the porch, composed and professional, a leather briefcase in his hand. He nodded politely, as if this were any ordinary visit. I stepped aside and invited him in. There was no need to explain. Everything that needed to be said would be said soon enough. We walked back toward the dining room together. The sound of our footsteps seemed louder than usual, echoing against the hardwood floors. When we entered, the shift in the room was immediate. Vanessa straightened in her chair, her expression tightening. Linda's posture became rigid, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Daniel looked at me, confusion replacing the quiet detachment he had carried all evening. I introduced the lawyer calmly, my voice even, almost detached. The formality of it created a distance that none of them seemed prepared for. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it with deliberate care, removing a set of documents that felt heavier than their weight. He began to read. His tone was steady, precise, carrying the authority of something that could not be dismissed. He stated clearly that the property belonged solely to me, that there were no shared claims, no implied ownership, no ambiguity. He explained that permission for them to reside in the house had been granted by me and could therefore be withdrawn by me. He then delivered the notice. 30 days. That was the time given for Vanessa and her mother to leave the property. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, filled with everything they had not expected to hear. Then he continued. He addressed the loan application. He spoke about the documentation that had been reviewed, about the inconsistencies in the signatures, about the legal implications of presenting information that did not align with ownership records. His words remained measured, but their meaning was unmistakable. What had been presented as a plan was now something that could carry serious consequences. Vanessa's composure broke first. The certainty that had defined her expression began to fracture, replaced by something uncertain, almost unrecognizable. Linda responded differently, her voice rising, her tone defensive, as she attempted to challenge the situation. But the lawyer did not engage emotionally. He simply reiterated the facts. I stood there listening, feeling none of the urgency that filled the room. I was not angry. I was not afraid. I was clear. When the lawyer finished, I spoke, not to argue, but to state what had already become undeniable. I said the house was mine. I said they had been allowed to stay, and that permission no longer existed. There was no need for more explanation than that. Daniel looked at me differently then. The distance in his expression gave way to something more unsettled, as if he were seeing me for the first time in weeks. There was no immediate response from him, only a quiet recognition that the situation had moved beyond anything he could ignore. Vanessa attempted to speak again, but her words lacked the control they once carried. The balance in the room had shifted, and there was no way to reverse it. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I simply stood in the space that had always been mine and allowed the truth to hold its place. For the first time since they had moved in, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was defining it, and in that moment, everything changed. If you felt the moment everything turned and there was no going back, comment number 6 below so I know you're still here. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. After the lawyer left, the house did not immediately return to silence. For a few moments, it held on to the tension like something suspended in the air, waiting to settle. No one spoke right away. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on all of us, but each person seemed to carry it differently. Vanessa stood near the table, her posture rigid, as if she were trying to gather the pieces of something that had already fallen apart. The confidence she had carried for weeks was gone, replaced by a kind of uncertainty that did not sit naturally on her. Linda moved more quickly, pacing the room, her energy sharp and restless, muttering under her breath as if refusing to accept what had just been made clear. Daniel did not move at all. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on the table, his expression blank in a way that felt more like shock than calm. It was as if the moment had caught up to him all at once, leaving him without anything to hold on to. I stood where I was, feeling the shift in the house not just around me, but within me. The calm I had held through the confrontation began to give way to something heavier. Not regret, not doubt, but the awareness of what had been set into motion. The movement started abruptly. Vanessa turned away from the table without looking at me and walked toward the stairs. Linda followed almost immediately. Within minutes, the quiet of the house was replaced by the sounds of drawers opening, footsteps moving quickly from one room to another, the low thud of objects being gathered and packed. I did not follow them. I remained in the living room, listening as the house filled with a different kind of noise, one that felt temporary and unsettled. Every sound carried a sense of urgency, but also something else, something final. Time passed in fragments. I did not measure it, only felt it moving forward without pause. Eventually the footsteps returned. Suitcases appeared near the door, bags set down with more force than necessary. Vanessa moved past me without a glance, her focus fixed on leaving rather than anything left behind. Daniel came last. He stood in the entryway for a moment, holding his bags, not yet stepping outside. He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if searching for something that might change the outcome. There was a question in his expression, but no words followed. I met his gaze without speaking. There was nothing left to explain. The decision had already been made, not just that night, but in the weeks leading up to it. He hesitated for a moment longer, then turned and walked out the door. The sound of it closing behind him was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything that had happened before. I stood there for a long time after they left, the stillness of the house settling slowly around me. The silence was different now. It was no longer crowded by tension or expectation. It was open, but it was also heavy. I moved through the rooms carefully, noticing how everything remained exactly where it had been left, yet nothing felt the same. The space was mine again, but it came with an absence I could not ignore. When I finally sat down, the emotions I had held back began to surface. Not all at once, but steadily, like something that had been waiting for permission. I felt the loss, not just of what had happened that night, but of what had been slipping away long before it. I questioned myself, not out of uncertainty, but because the cost of what I had done was now fully visible. I had protected my home, my space, my sense of self. But in doing so, I had also allowed something else to break. The house was quiet again, and for the first time in a long while, I was completely alone. The first few days after they left felt unfamiliar, not because the house was empty, but because it was finally still. There were no footsteps upstairs, no voices moving through the walls, no quiet rearranging of things that did not belong to anyone but me. At first, the silence felt heavy, pressing against me in ways I had not expected. But as the days passed, it began to settle into something different. I moved through the house slowly, almost carefully, as if I were reintroducing myself to it. I put things back where they had once been. The photograph of my husband returned to its place in the entryway. The chair by the window faced the direction it always had. These were small actions, but each one felt like reclaiming something that had been taken, not just physically, but quietly, over time. My routine returned, though it did not feel exactly the same. My walks were longer now, not because I needed the exercise, but because I needed the space to think. The sound of the ocean became something I listened to more closely, as if it held answers I had not yet found. Afternoons were quieter, but no longer uncomfortable. I began to understand the difference between loneliness and peace. As I thought about everything that had happened, the details arranged themselves differently in my mind. Conversations I had once dismissed revealed patterns I could now see clearly. The small changes, the careful words, the decisions made without me, none of them had been accidental. They had been part of something intentional. Daniel called a few days later. His voice sounded uncertain, as if he were not sure how to begin. The conversation was brief, filled with pauses rather than words. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. I did not ask questions, and I did not offer explanations. It was not distance I was creating, but space. When he called again, his tone had shifted slightly. There was less certainty in the way he spoke, less of the quiet confidence he had carried before. He mentioned things in passing, small details that suggested everything was not as stable as he had believed. I listened without interrupting, allowing him to speak without guiding him toward any conclusion. For the first time, I was not trying to fix anything. I was not trying to restore what had been lost or return things to the way they once were. I understood now that some things could not be undone, and more importantly, they should not be. I still cared about my son. That had not changed. But I had learned that caring for someone did not mean accepting everything they did. It did not mean allowing them to diminish you in the process. One evening, I sat in the living room with the windows open, letting the breeze move through the house. It felt different then, not just quiet, but mine again. There was no tension in the air, no expectation I had to meet. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I was holding something together. I felt like I was standing on my own. If you feel the weight of everything that has happened and sense a powerful ending is coming, comment number 8 below to stay until the end. Now let's move into the final part of this story. Weeks passed before I saw Daniel again in person. By then, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt natural, not forced. I had made small changes, nothing dramatic, just enough to remind myself that every space belonged to me again. The light seemed softer in the afternoons, the rooms more open, as if the house itself had exhaled. When he knocked on the door, I knew it was him before I opened it. There was something in the way he waited, not impatient, not certain, just present. He looked different when I let him in, thinner, perhaps, or simply worn down by something he had not yet found words for. We sat in the kitchen, across from each other, the same table, but a different silence between us. It was not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. He spoke first, his voice steady but quieter than I remembered. He told me he had left Vanessa. He did not offer details, only that things had become clearer in ways he could not ignore anymore. I listened without interrupting. There was no sense of urgency in me, No need to respond quickly or fill the space with reassurance. What he was saying mattered, but so did the way he had come to say it. He admitted that he had been wrong, not just in that final moment, but in all the smaller ones that had led to it. He said he had avoided conflict, convinced himself that things would resolve on their own. He saw now that his silence had been part of the problem. I nodded, not because I needed to agree, but because I understood. There was nothing to argue about anymore. I told him I forgave him. The words felt simple, but they carried weight. Forgiveness did not erase what had happened, and it did not restore what had been. It meant I was no longer holding on to the anger that once defined everything between us. I also told him that things would be different, that if we were to have a relationship, it would have to be built on something stronger than assumption. Respect was no longer optional. He accepted that without resistance. We sat there for a while longer, not speaking, just sharing the space in a way that felt honest. It was not a return to what we had before. It was something new, and for the first time that felt enough. Months have passed since everything changed, and the house has settled into a quiet that no longer feels unfamiliar. It feels earned. The light moves through the rooms the same way it always has, but now I notice it differently, as if I am fully present in a space that once felt like it was slipping away from me. My days have returned to their rhythm, though they carry a different weight. I still walk in the mornings, still sit with my tea in the afternoons, but there is a steadiness in me now that was not there before. I no longer measure my peace by how well I keep things from falling apart. I measure it by how firmly I stand within myself. The house reflects that change. I have made it mine again, not by restoring everything exactly as it was, but by allowing it to grow with me. Some things remain, like the photograph on the mantel and the chair by the window. Others have shifted, not because they were taken from me, but because I chose to change them. Daniel visits sometimes. Our conversations are simple, unforced. There is no need to revisit what happened, no need to explain it again. What matters is how we speak to each other now. There is a respect between us that did not exist before, something quieter but more honest. I have thought often about the decision I made, about the line I chose not to cross. For a long time, I believed that loving someone meant giving them everything, even when it cost me something in return. I understand now that the love without boundaries is not kindness, it is surrender. The choice I made was not easy. It came with loss, with nights where the silence felt heavier than I could carry, but it also gave me something I had not realized I was missing. It gave me myself. That secret I kept, the one I once questioned, was never about withholding trust. It was about protecting something essential, something that could not be replaced once it was gone. As I sit here now, in the quiet of the evening, I do not feel alone. I feel complete. The house around me is no longer just a place I live in. It is a reflection of the life I have chosen to keep. And for the first time in a very long time, that is enough. In the end, life has a quiet way of teaching what no one ever prepares us for. Sometimes, the hardest lessons do not come from strangers, but from the moments when trust is tested and boundaries are pushed beyond what feels fair. It becomes clear that holding on to everything is not the same as holding on to what truly matters. There is a difference between love and losing yourself in the process. Strength does not always look loud or dramatic. Often, it is found in the quiet decisions, the ones made without applause, the ones that restore dignity and protect peace. Letting go is not always about giving up. Sometimes, it is about choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others. And in that choice, there is a kind of freedom that cannot be taken away. Thank you for being here. And if this story spoke to you, share your thoughts, follow, and stay connected.